You know what's fascinating about human relationships? We're all walking around with invisible scorecards, mentally tracking every favor, every slight, every act of kindness, like some kind of emotional accountants.
That's such an interesting way to put it. I was just thinking about how this shows up in something as simple as group lunch orders at work.
Well, speaking of keeping score, I witnessed something at a coffee shop recently that perfectly captures this whole dynamic. Someone paid for the person behind them in line, and instead of just accepting the kindness, the recipient immediately felt compelled to pay for the next person.
Hmm, that really shows how deeply ingrained this reciprocity mindset is in our culture, doesn't it?
Exactly, and that's what makes Jesus' teaching in Luke 6:33 so radical. He essentially asks, if you're only good to people who are good to you, what's so special about that? It's like he's challenging our entire framework for relationships.
You know what strikes me about that teaching? It's how it manages to be both incredibly simple and profoundly challenging at the same time.
Well, let's break this down a bit. Studies in behavioral psychology have shown that humans are hardwired for reciprocity. It's actually been crucial for our survival as a species. But Jesus is suggesting something that goes completely against this natural instinct.
So, how do we actually put this into practice? Because it seems like such a massive shift from how we naturally operate.
You know, I think it starts with recognizing the difference between transactional and transformational relationships. In transactional relationships, we're always calculating the give and take. But transformational relationships, they operate from a completely different paradigm.
That reminds me of research showing that people who focus on giving, rather than receiving, actually report higher levels of life satisfaction and emotional well being.
Exactly. And here's what's fascinating. When we stop keeping score, we often end up receiving more than we would have if we'd been counting. It's like that Proverbs verse, whoever refreshes others will be refreshed.
Though I imagine we need to be careful about how we interpret that. It's not meant to be a spiritual version of karma, right?
Right. It's more about the natural outcome of living generously. Think about it like this. When you're not constantly tracking what you're owed, you become more aware of and grateful for the good things that do come your way.
That makes me think about how this might apply to larger social issues, like community service or environmental stewardship.
Well, that's where this teaching becomes really revolutionary. Imagine approaching climate change not from the perspective of what's in it for me, but simply because it's the right thing to do. Or consider how this might transform our approach to social justice issues.
That really expands the scope of this teaching beyond just personal relationships.
And you know what's particularly challenging about this? It requires us to be vulnerable. When you give without expectation of return, you're opening yourself up to potential disappointment or hurt.
That's such an important point. How do we maintain that generous spirit while also protecting ourselves from being taken advantage of?
Well, here's the key distinction. This teaching isn't about becoming a doormat. It's about choosing to act from a place of strength and freedom rather than obligation. Research in positive psychology shows that this kind of intentional kindness actually increases our sense of personal power and agency.
That's really interesting. So it's almost like the opposite of what we might expect.
Exactly. And here's another counterintuitive finding. Studies have shown that people who practice unconditional giving often report feeling more in control of their lives, not less. It's because they're no longer at the mercy of others' responses.
That makes me think about how this might change our experience of disappointment in relationships.
Well, when we stop keeping score, we actually free ourselves from a lot of unnecessary suffering. Think about it. How much of our relationship stress comes from unmet expectations about reciprocity?
That's so true. It's like we're constantly setting ourselves up for disappointment.
And you know what's really powerful about this? When we stop keeping score, we create space for genuine connection. It's like removing this invisible barrier that we didn't even realize was there.
So, in essence, it's about moving from transaction to transformation.
Exactly. And that transformation starts with small, everyday choices. It's not about making grand gestures. It's about consistently choosing to give without expecting anything in return.
That makes it feel more manageable somehow. Like we can start practicing this right now in small ways.
Yes, and that's really the heart of what Jesus was teaching. He's not just giving us a new set of rules, he's inviting us into a completely different way of being. One where we're free to love generously because we know we're already loved abundantly.
That's really beautiful. And perhaps that's the key to actually living this out.
Well, as we wrap up, here's what I find most compelling. True love doesn't keep score, not because it's naive, but because it's strong enough not to need to. And that kind of strength, that's what can transform not just our relationships, but our entire world.